We're on. Good, well, it's kind of the evening. I'll say good evening, and welcome to Kunstinstituut Melly. I'll start there kind of looking at everyone, and then we'll zone in. So, welcome to this focus program, which is the prelude to our evening of entertainment and celebration as we open the fall season of our exhibitions here at Kunstinstituut Melly. My name is Beatriz Santiago. I'm the Research and Programs Manager here, and I'm joined by a number of wonderful guests who I'll introduce shortly. It'll be a conversation, not an interview. Thanks from our Director Sophia Hernandez-Chong-Kui, who is with us this evening and who's led this wonderful series of programs. The conversation will be 1 hour. For that reason, we're going to keep it really within the table. We won't have a Q&A, but of course the intention is that we immediately move into the opening, into mingling, and so the conversation will happen throughout the evening, and with the benefit of some drinks downstairs in the cafe as well. I would also add that when it comes to those conversations and mingling, we have two other people who are very important who aren't at the table with us, who are the curators of Salad Grass, with whom we are presenting the exhibition of Beatriz Santiago Muñoz, Anneli Dever, and Yawo. So we really invite you to approach them as well with any questions in relation to the ongoing collaborations between Rotterdam and the Caribbean, and in relation to Beatriz's show in particular. So we have the feeling here of being a little bit at a seance as we sit in the middle of the room, sort of channeling things in. And we were having a conversation last night about mediumship and about the principle of mediumship to kind of, as a subject, to get out of the way and to let other things flow through. And given the very dynamic people at the table, I think as a moderator that will really be my function as well, because there's so much to ricochet between our guests. So my focus will really be just to give a few notes at the opening in terms of why we have these people together at the table. So this evening's focus program really brings two exhibitions into dialogue, which are two of the three exhibition programs that we have opening tonight. And as one further prelude note, I'd like to mention that we will have further programs in relation to Pablo Castañeda's exhibition coming further in our fall program, so please stay tuned for them. The two exhibitions that we'll be discussing this evening are by Beatriz Santiago Muñoz, In the Navel of the Dream, and Sam Samiee's painting exhibition, A Garden of Clouds. And something that will really ground the conversation is something that's quite common between both of the exhibitions and the bodies of work, in terms of a concern with signification and translation, and the sensory quality of place, particularly within the post-colonial fold. So In the Navel of the Dream is in fact a film exhibition, and it has as its focus a very deep examination of how being is interrelated with place and territoriality, and in the subtle registers of history in places such as Puerto Rico and Haiti specifically. The title itself, In the Navel of a Dream, is also a citation of Sigmund Freud, of course from the interpretation of dreams. So that then comes in dialogue with an exhibition of paintings by Sam Samiee that requires a few pointers in which to constellate it. The exhibition is part of our ongoing Anchored series. This was a series of artistic commissions that we initiated through the name change process, in which we were seeking ways to continue to ground ourselves in our building, our street, and our neighborhood as we went through a name change process. It's related to an archival exhibition we have outside, which investigates what was on this site before it became the bit street and the building we have now, which in fact was a botanical garden. And this map shows with the red lines cutting across the plans for development of the Straat in 1870, which cut across this green rectangle in the middle, which was the Hortus Botanicus. So upon the invitation to develop an anchored exhibition, Sam Samiee proposed a pivot in the question of re-anchoring from that large cross street here, the Bidstraat, to the smaller side street, the Boomgaardstraat, which means Orchard Street, and which was the edge of the botanical garden, and which is the street upon which our new namesake, Melly now stands. So these are the coordinates that we'll be delving into. And to start off the conversation, we will be moving through a series of references from the exhibitions and just moving around the table before opening up to a freer conversation. And so the first is from the Inner Navel of the Dream, and from one of the three filmic works in there, a film called El Cuervo, la Fosa y la Yegua. I'm sorry about Spanish. The Raven, the Mare, and the Trench. Maybe Jeske, just please correct my pronunciation and introduce the image that we're looking at.
Right. So, yeah, I thought I would share some images actually that did not make it into the film, but they're actually maybe can explain a bit of where that work began. So, in the film, you hear, and you see Guy Regis Jr., who is a writer and translator, a Haitian writer and translator, and he's speaking about a kind of ongoing project of his to translate à la recherche du temps perdu, Proust's work into Haitian Creole. And so this is, when he was telling me about this project, he described the moment in which he began thinking about what would happen if you transpose the text into Haitian Creole. So this is like a cheap copy, a cheap edition of the work, in which he has crossed out classique for classic in Creole. And I guess I wanted to show that because I feel like even in that gesture, you can really begin to see what it means to take that a text and put it in another language. So it makes you ask, what classic? What does even the word mean something different in a different context? Does time and the way that it's constructed mean something different from within Haiti than within France? And these are questions that he refers to in terms of language and materials, and he very succinctly describes the questions involved in translation and the space of thinking that going from one language to another can open up, as well as thinking of materials and objects, sensory experiences from one moment and place to another.
There's a film also that we can play.
So this is a little clip, maybe just 20 seconds or something like that. This is also not included in the film, but not playing. But anyway, it's a... So what you see and hear in the film is actually, this was shot in 2016, and what you are watching up there is him watching this, listening to himself. So he's already listening and going, it's already changed so much. So he is also hearing himself and translating from one moment to another and finding that there is a difference with himself from that moment in 2016 to the moment in which I was shooting then.
Great, thank you. So we'll continue with a first round. and arrived to this painting, which is part of A Garden of Clouds. And Sam, perhaps you could introduce this image and this painting in terms of your training in Dutch painting and the production of a certain kind of self, which also really grounded the development of this work into some reflections that you had about the Persian tradition of the garden and its production of a certain kind of self as well.
Thank you very much. So this was the first painting I did for this series of A Garden of Clouds, and I called it also A Garden of Clouds. Well, we are all familiar with a lot of paintings from the Dutch tradition of marine paintings where there are a lot of clouds, but also landscapes that include a lot of different shapes of clouds. I have tried to always remain within this, or describe my practice as someone who has been educated in Western tradition of painting, but particularly the Dutch painting since my years in the Netherlands and education here in the Netherlands. We got to the title of the exhibition together very early in the process, looking at what we could do, what we have at hand, what we need to address, and what needs to come about eventually. And well, it was a big part of it was situating myself within this process as an Iranian living in the Netherlands, looking at the history of post-coloniality in the city of Rotterdam or in the Netherlands at large. We walked through the neighborhood with each other. We had some speculation about what we were gonna encounter and how or in which spots we could get deeper and bring some symbols, signifiers, objects, materials, people, figures, which would be useful for rethinking or making this process of the name change a process that becomes a broader, elaborated process of bringing more people and more living things and more objects and more documents from the archive within the process. So I knew that I want to, well, if you walk to the central station, you see this corridor on this left side of the station with the Dutch ships. The Dutch ships are so important in reliefs in Alexanderplein, in Amsterdam, on Tropeninstituut. Like the Dutch ships are so important symbols of the Dutch identity. We say Alexander borrowed Dutch ships when he took over the world. So it begins already very early in time. So that was one thing that is anchoring the Dutch identity. As a Persian, Iranian person, gardens are very important paradigms for how we organize our lives, our sociality, our art. Bavan Behpur says that we are very good with cinema because it's such a garden experience, entering the threshold, going to different corners, you see different directions. So I knew that garden, and I was also editing the work of Riaz Hawi on an Indian Parsi broker who was negotiating between the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, the Indians, the Mughals. And through this editing, I came across this idea that as much as the English and the Dutch want to take pride in ships as this dynamic mode of taking over the world and trade, Persian net world takes pride in how a garden brings so many people and things, and the whole brokership happens in a garden, the gift-giving process, etc., etc. So this painting, and then the clouds, of course, that are the carriers. It was in the sign of the former logo of the institute. It is in Dutch painting, and I was always very impressed with the Dutch clouds as the most important feature in the Dutch landscape. In a flat land, the mega-sized clouds are always the most eye-catching objects, right? So, and they're also the metaphor for carrying thoughts or conversations in cartoons, in visual story making. So I knew that I want to put the map of the the botanical garden that was here. I took from the Wikipedia page of Cornelius Witte de With the picture of one of the wars that they had, I think with the Swedish Navy at that moment. And the third one is one that is up to us to decide what else we can put in. So this was the map of what became decision making for what other clouds and what other signifiers we want to bring into the exhibition.
Thank you for that introduction to the exhibition upstairs. As we continue around, I'd like to also introduce and welcome Francis Mc Kee, who's travelled to be with us today from Glasgow in Scotland, where he's the director of the CCA, on the introduction of Beatriz as an interlocutor and guest. And in looking at the new work in the exhibition, called The Point Upon Which It Turns, two-screen work, first exhibited upstairs here, you were interested in this particular image or presence within one of those films. Could you introduce why you've singled this out for us?
I can't remember. I would even swear I never said that. But I probably was interested, I was interested in it being European, and it's coming out of a quarry in the Caribbean. And so I was interested in the notion that there's the place, there's the quarry, and out of it someone scoops an entire city and it's all European. Yeah. And then in the opposite with your work, where there's a garden, and those gardens are all designed for plants from the New World, and so they're all scooped from the New World and brought back here. So there's this odd exchange between the two worlds that isn't simply described by colonialism, because it's more like love and theft. People want the plants, people love the plants, people like the statues. There is kind of this odd grey area between the two. So that's what I liked, is that combination of Europe and the New World, and it's not so simple. Right. That's what I liked.
Beautiful.
I'll stop then.
Thank you. And then as we continue to go around, I'd also like to introduce and welcome with us Elizabeth A. Povinelli, who is a scholar. Who's a scholar and who in fact was trained as a philosopher, but who was recruited into the scholarship of anthropology by a group of indigenous now filmmakers, and who's always done a certain kind of philosophy at its limit. So who's always kind of done a certain kind of philosophy inside out, from the colonial shore of the top end of Australia. And so I then want to throw to a theoretical perspective of which references you might sort of direct or interest us in understanding or coming to terms with Sam's painting of a transition and its traumatic attachments, and Beatriz's attempts to produce images that kind of rewrite the globalized circuitry of a place such as the Caribbean. That's a question.
I was waiting for that big where it goes at the end. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the incredible work. One of the things that, knowing that you're interested in psychoanalysis and that, and the question of post-coloniality, bodies, trauma, not merely circulation, but sedimentation, and different ways of pulling out from sedimentation, and also the whole question of translation when situated in, say, the French Caribbean, that it evoked for me thoughts that I've had but also struggled with for years around the question of whether we're involved in a problematic of translation, or we're really involved in your work, involved in a struggle over something we could call transfiguration. That is, especially, say, in the clip that you showed just now, the movement from classique to classic, for me at least, isn't a movement of meaning across semantic domains, but a struggle over the relationality that figures bodies differently. And in terms of psychoanalysis, the long-standing interest in, I'm going to massacre French, trot bébé, the walker, the baby walker, right? And that shows up in Lacan's mirror stage, in which he's saying, before we can enter the symbolic, before we can borrow subjectivity from language, we have to be somewhere to be the borrower, then becomes the subject, right? So that classic mirror stage, that's me, right? It gives us literally a diagram or kind of skeletal, what he would call this walker, that we can have the body. But what the great French theorists the great theorists of the French Caribbean, right, and especially Fanon and Glissant and certainly Sylvia Wynter and were always primarily interested in, because, you know, Lacan and Freud, they're all like, you know, universal, like blah, 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 and, you know, first we enter I, and it hangs, you know, first we have the body, and I hangs on it, and then you get the he, she, and then race and everything comes after, right? And what Fanon in particular really powerfully does is say, no, the distribution of the gaze is, in these situations of racism and colonialism, is the distribution of different kinds of trot bébés, right? So that some people are given trot bébés that don't quite work, right? And because they're affective as well as structural, right? And so the struggle of translation for me is not a struggle of moving meaning, but saying, fuck it, this is not my body, right? And with the garden, it's like, where are, your work, both of them, where is my body? Is it in the trench, right? Is it in the plants? And who gets to decide where my body is? And this, again, is not a translation, but a mode of what kind of world will we build such that we inhabit it in that building. So it's not meaning for me, but building and inhabiting. And I think that's all through the work. So it's probably long, but blah.
I mean, I think you.
I know, right.
I think you sort of, you beautifully put a finger on some of the questions of commonalities, or like things that both Sam and Beatriz are wrestling with in terms of a certain kind of the production of a certain kind of subject and what it means to prize it open and negotiate its demands on people. But I'd like to draw forward then the question of like that intense specificity of place as well. And maybe Beatriz, you could talk about how you selected the two locations that appear within the new work, one of which is a quarry and one of which is a kind of an island archipelago.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I would say, preface, is that I don't go about my work kind of drawing it out conceptually and then going to find it. So actually I shot a lot more than what's in there, and it went in a lot of different directions before you kind of between what you have thought, what you have, what you didn't know you were going to find, like, you know, the emaciated cow and the calf in the film. You know, you can't, I didn't, you know, draw it out and then go find it, but rather, but it's there in the middle doing things, you know, in the film. So I just want to say that, you know, first come the images and the place and the process, and then there's ideas that emerge between the place, the film, and, you know, in the sobre la marcha, however you say that, as you go. But that said, I was interested in the marble quarry as this whole, because it's an abandoned marble quarry, and because it's such a strong, overwhelming physical sensation of being there and feeling like this material has been redistributed through the world into other forms and so other meanings as well. So I was going back and forth between filming the marble sculptures, which I don't know if those sculptures came exactly from that quarry, probably not, but in between filming those different spaces, different ways of thinking appear. And then the caves are in the southern part of Puerto Rico in a place called Lajas, and they're sort of like, they're land and they're not land. They're built from coral and mangrove, and if a strong hurricane comes, they sort of rebuild themselves in a different way, and so in a way they are you can see more quickly what happens to all of the earth, that is constantly moving and changing, and things are being, but it just goes faster there, as the islands are, they're not islands, they're caves, they're not they're not that big, and I would have to tell a long story about the person that's moving the boat. But that also, it actually had a strong influence in where we went, because he's someone that knows this space of 16 or so caves really intimately, and it's not anyone that can navigate that space as he could. So it's also there is a knowledge about this place that is only available to someone that has lived there and for 30 years. So being with him on a boat allows me to think in between what he knows and what I am seeing through the camera.
It's beautiful that you sort of reference this like intimate local geographic knowledge, because the hanging title of this program is also Intimate Grammars, which borrows from a text that Beth has summarized some of the points of as well. But you also have a fairly intimate knowledge of Beatriz's work over a number of years. You've written about Beatriz's work. We have the new work upstairs, and I was curious to get to some of your first impressions of this new 2-channel work and some of the things that leap out of it for you in relation to sort of previous examples that you're familiar with.
It was interesting. I kind of look at the other works that are there and relate it to that, because the new work is quite abstract. In some ways, almost nothing happens in the new work, and more things happen in the older works, but that helps you read the new works. But then when you were talking there now, I was thinking about how you're interested in the whole. And in a way, people think a whole is just a whole and it's the end of something. And actually, wholes are generally the start of something else. There's never such a thing as a whole. A hole's the end of one thing, it's the start of the next thing. And the environmental movement came out of holes, because when they bombed London, they started doing lectures on weeds. And that led to the growth of the environmental movement in the 40s onwards. So it's always one thing leads to the other. So I was thinking of that, and just thinking of the constant movement that also comes up in the Proust piece as well. And I was thinking of the clouds. Everyone laughed at me yesterday because I mentioned Hamlet and clouds. It was vital. Because he looks at clouds and kind of goes, look at that cloud, it's like a camel. He goes, no, it's actually like a weasel. And then he goes, no, it's like a whale, all within the space of a minute. So it just keeps morphing all the time. But we want to fix things constantly. That's where the colonial practice comes in. It's more than politics, it's fixing things and making things monolithic. So that, the clouds in your piece where everyone goes, there's a big gasp when the clouds come on, and they're huge and they're in the water. That's immense, and same with your clouds, and you both have this constant movement going on in the pieces. So that's what I was taking from it, was the constant movement, kind of the self and the perception and everything. So I was getting very philosophical and Buddhist about it. But I should stop there again.
I just thought something that you said made me think, I don't even know if it's directly related, but I was thinking about the word Manko. It's a word that describes somebody who's missing one arm, but it is a word that describes someone with what they do not have instead of what they have. And so it is, I was thinking, when you were talking about wholes, I was thinking about, the describing what is not there because it is so much more present or material, than what is there. Yeah. Mm.
Do you want to jump in?
Well, is mine louder or am I just louder? I think I'm just louder. It's fine. In order not to be Buddhist, I want to go back to the statue and the whole, and the plants and the garden and then the scrape off of the garden and the creation of Vitavith and then scraping off that and putting Melly, right? And on the one hand, I agree, like there's just this constant movement, and I also agree that there's that one mode by which colonial power and racist forms of building and relationality and keeping in place is to try and fix something, like that kind, this kind, that kind of body, this kind of body. The other, obviously, aspect of those relations are affixing with a directionality of value. You're fixed so that values flow in a certain direction, right, and accumulate in one area, with toxicity, kind of the excrement of that accumulation in another area. So here we have flow, right? But at least if we're in a round table thinking about those marble statues and that whole, that we can never think motion, movement in some abstract way. Definitely not if we start with history of the European invasion of everything and the creation of certain relations. It's always a struggle to not only define how movement moves and stuff moves, but how in that movement value accumulation occurs. And then I guess the second thing, so those statues, I look at those statues, and I think, let's say they came from that quarry. I think, Puerto Rico has sovereignty wherever that statue is, because it is there, right? It's literally like, we think they colonized Puerto Rico, removed the marble, right? And I think, well, Puerto Rico, the marble itself, extended its sovereignty wherever it went, right? But what's the practical value of that staying? The second thing, and then I'll stop, is that sometimes keeping relations in place is not fixing, but creatively trying to keep relations in place is a counter hegemonic practice. So, say my indigenous Karrabing colleagues, trying to keep their lands in the shape that keeps them in a certain shape, in the context of ongoing racialized colonial extraction, now climate change, is an incredibly creative practice. But the goal, it's not fixity of value so you can move it and accumulate it, but it's not just flowy flow either. And so I think, for me, it's like, I know you're just quipping about being a Buddhist, but but it's, I think we always have to really concretize what we mean by these flows. And
Well, I'd say to actually change those flows, you can't just be Buddhist about it, you got to go out and do something.
So then, speaking exactly of the project of trying to change the flows, or as Beth contributed earlier, this idea of rather than translation of refiguration. I mean, that was something that, Sam, that you were grappling with very, very directly in this commission to do an anchored work that happens, in fact, after the name of this institution has changed, but as the name still lies on the street and as the public consciousness around these matters remains in progress. Could you talk about the process of producing the images? I know you struggled. I know there was a certain amount of resistance and traction in arriving at what kinds of images should come out of a reflection on the garden, and even around whether images of David and Melly should be produced whatsoever.
Yeah, indeed, I struggled for multiple reasons. One was technical struggle, because I'm also just working so impulsively. It's very rarely that I know that I have to make a show which the confinement and the reach and the addressee are so certainly known. So, and I think if I hadn't catalogued so much of the former impulses of mine, painterly speaking, I couldn't do this. So a big part of it was the relying on the conversation with you, which was so important, because I was like this person constantly like sending messages to Vivian like, hey, I want to do this, what do you think? Like waiting to see that, well, what is her response? I mean, you really reflected a lot of institutional and as well as the researcher self in the process. So it was really a process of lending my hand, because you don't paint with your brain, you paint with your hands, and but then and the whole process of my painting education was how to liberate your hand from your brain. So this was very difficult on one hand. On the other hand, multiple things come into play when you think about signifiers that constituted this place, this history, or constituted my history. And I think it's very important what you mentioned in relation to keeping things in place, because we also talked so much about Islamophobia in City of Rotterdam. How, again, it's such a big subject, I'm not even going to try to open it up too much, because like the flooding conversation will take everything away. But in relation to keeping some certain things in place, for Persians, for some Muslims, I think a lot of work had to be done, right? So taking credit for some medical advancement, some scientific advancement, mathematical, literary advancements. I love the way Christopher Bolla says it, like there is a big part of unacknowledged self in every person from the Islamicate. You could be non-Muslim, you could be Jewish, you could be Christian, you could be non-practicing Muslim, but coming from that part of the world, the way that it is not registered, and trying to keep those relations in place to say, I wanna be acknowledged for the invention of soap and for disinfecting hand and for the type of medicine that was practiced here that brought me, for example, to paint the soap. And also to acknowledge aspects of rationalism that were integral in industrialization, like the making of the microscope, that was taken up by that part of the world I come from as a celebration of Europe. They were as much as Iranians were completely neglecting the catastrophe and disaster of colonialism, they were very much celebrating advancements of science in Europe. So these relationships are so little known in this city, while it is so much is there. And I'm trying to think about the plant. So it was very difficult to paint a plant which I haven't seen. I experienced my Dutch colonial self painting that plant up there, because the color scheme is so European. It's like a scientific painting tradition. It was so much confabulation in like how to put the agave in a pot, For the picture of Witte de Wit was very difficult also to paint, because I didn't want to celebrate that figure again, but I also wanted to bring back the signifier into the game so that we could discuss it, because of this eradication of the signifier, I think, was a big loss for us. And I had started this conversation in 2014, but I think in that time we knew we have a problem with these statues. We didn't know what to do with it. And it was this process became probably redeeming unfinished projects where we had started criticizing. I had started criticizing such figures like those sculptures more in Amsterdam, where I used to live. And well, probably the most difficult, the most emotionally loaded, the most also evading verbalization for me was painting of Melly. I didn't know what she herself was going to think about it. If she's going to be like, oh, you didn't paint me beautifully enough, or I don't look like this, my eyebrows are not like that, why do you make me like, you know? And I spent more time on painting her than any other painting in the room. Yeah, and it made me very emotional throughout painting it. It was never a case where it was never the case that I would paint a person I don't know at all as such, but I also know I love this part of the Melly TV where there was this like cutout of a circle, and then people could go behind it and say "Ik ben Melly." Everybody could say "I am Melly." Many people of the neighborhood would say "I am Melly." So this crowning of a person was very interesting, but I really had a lot of very different emotional feelings that I don't know how useful it is to try to put in words, you know.
Beautiful.
You did use about 3 or 4 different painting formats. Like you changed yourself in a sense in painting styles, which you also did, like the 16mm that looks very different between Proust, which is really sharp and really high resolution, and then the 2 new painting, and then the 16mm, which looks more documentary. And both of you have kind of got many different aesthetic positions. So it's kind of interesting.
I think also it was a prior to this conversation, for the preparations we talked about these modes of production also being so integral, of course, for artists who conceptually define everything and then they find the materialization probably is a bit different, but for us probably is a very shared integral part of interweaving meaning and concept that emerges from the mode of production, right? From how you hold, because you said something about how you hold the camera.
Most everything that you're seeing there is, especially with the 16mm, is handheld, even, you know, or like making objects that I'm holding in front of the camera. The idea of, I mean, I'm working with a 16mm camera without a magazine. Is just 100 foot rolls that you have to change all the time. And I mean, it's not that it creates a certain way of moving, a slowness to the process, and in, you know, how do you say that when you cannot predict necessarily, a non-predictability, you know, that it's kind of like, you know, there's a kind of weather in between you and, you know, what is happening, that you have to adjust to and, you know, and think about, and that's very different than working with a video camera that you can shoot however much you want, and the film is not going to run out, and you can see exactly what you're doing, and sort of, and those things affect, you know, how you are thinking about the place. The film also, the one in Lajas of the case, as we were shooting, there was a storm beginning and then leaving. So there was this like constant, you know, readjustment there as well. Yeah. But I mean, I think that for me, it's the form that smaller scale, more human. Is an important part of the work, especially coming out of a place in the Caribbean where we have been more subjects, which subjects create meaning as well in the way that they stand in front of the camera or decide not to be in it. But, you know, it has been the moment when you decide to be the person behind the camera, you're taking up a position that is not the usual position for people in the Caribbean. And you have to also decide, well, I'm going to come back down to earth and not be, you know, I don't want an aerial view, I don't want to move like a machine, I don't want to, all these, you know, movements that we have already kind of integrated as a certain kind of cinematic language, you have to step away from or step outside of that space and see what other kind of formal language can emerge. And it sometimes requires sort of breaking up that rational plane, so that even if what is coming out is a bit senseless or is a rearranging of sense that you don't quite understand yet, it opens up the possibility for something else.
Can I ask a question? And it kind of, it stretches maybe in an awkward way between this last two exchanges. I keep on thinking when Vivian asked about locality and you brought up the skipper, the captain, the boat master who, yeah.
It's a very small boat. But
I know, I'm making it seem like a huge ship. But you said how he knows this place because he's been 30 years?
Yeah.
I think you said 30, yeah. And for me, it's like, yeah, because his body is not just in his body is also in his boat, and the boat is in the sea, and so his body's in the sea. And so much of your work really about these extensions past what we think where the body is. But I was thinking, oh my God, but he's probably now in seas that aren't the same seas. Here's the change, right? And because we're like climate. I mean, we were talking last night about the massive cyclones that are just right, and the changing of the sea. And I've just, when you're saying, I was just thinking, here's a place in which you have to find yourself a new body, a new relation, right? So I was thinking that, but when you brought up the techniques, like I don't know how to do this, and you were saying like going from 16 millimeter to digital, it's so awkward. I'm kind of wondering how you think about the relationship between having to build yourselves as artists new bodies relative to technique and the differential new bodies that we all are building. And I mean, we all have to build new bodies, but differentially, because, you know, the bodies that folks have to build in Puerto Rico after, like, the Trump, like, yeah, right, are different than the ones that, you know, have to be built if you're white. And so I'm wondering if the technique of trying or failing, like, do you think about your technique and the content? Is this, yeah.
I think it was very integral. Like the struggle you mentioned, you gave it a proper representation in your question. So, well, you did, because it was very much. I was always very limited to my European education, and I wished that with studying Persian literature further and further, and the modes of relation anthropologically within the Persian world, I broadened my scope of understanding things by looking into theology, comparison between, you know, Abrahamic religions and non-Abrahamic religions of Indo-European world. But with this particular project, and the conversations, indeed, I realized that the landscape, the people I'm painting, I went to Kashmir and I saw this Chenar. We have Chenar in Iran, where Kashmiris believe is brought from Iran 400 years ago. And we don't have those Chenars anymore because there is no water in Iran. But they are thriving in Kashmir. And it was so weird. I was in the airport and I had tears in my eyes. I had tears in my eyes on the street. I had we had trainers when I was a kid. We don't have them. We have to decide that we have to cut them or they were gonna die. But, well, I was educated in painting male, white, European beauty. And then I was really struggling thinking, oh, what about Melly? Like, well, maybe I have been trying to paint like Southwest Asian bodies and some other bodies, like, but yeah, I don't know. I realized that probably the changes in the world are gonna be quicker than my adaptability.
I don't know if I have like I said you go because I don't have a good answer. Or, I mean, like, all I can say is, like, that my method is really knowing that I don't know, is to give myself many obstacles so that I cannot reproduce the way that I have been trained. So you know, putting problems in front of, you know, so that you have to get around, you know, incorporating chance and improvisation, making sure that it's between me and where he takes me in the boat and not exactly where I chose, you know. So those things are maybe what can disorganize me in a way that I don't go again and again to the same techniques, to the same body, to the same syntax or, you know, forms that I, like most people that went to film school or art school, were organized in, you know.
I was thinking of the Godzilla piece you made after Hurricane Maria, because that, with this giant microphone on, that you had to make a piece, you know, you had no control over what happened in not only the climate, the entire landscape, which used to be so green, and everything you do is really green. And then you sent all these pictures to me, they're all brown. There was no greenness left, just brownness. But you made this film that was upside down and backwards and, you know, full of tempests and all sorts of things that you had no control over what was going to happen there. Science at work. Yes, I knew it was reflecting off the water and all the hertzes were changing.
That was the medium that we have. No, that was the trying to speak, and here we are shutting.
Yeah, it's the water. There's some, but you know, the climate changed so much that your filmmaking changed massively for that film because of the climate, and you made something that still reflects in the new stuff, which quite often is going backwards or upside down. And that's a more kind of refined version of Godzilla, which was just crazy response, excuse me, to a crazy situation, you know, climactically. Yeah. So there's something there that you're responding, but you don't even you can't control it.
Yeah.
But you know what? Oops. Yes. I just think I haven't. That's not up there, is there?
No.
Okay. I was like, I missed the Godzilla. No. Okay. You know, one of the things, Sammy, that you just said was really, it's also poignant. It's like, I don't know if I can, because you know, I think of habitus, habit, like, you know, we're always like, break your hand, or if you're an intellectual, break your mind, like, you know, just break it. And you know, we see a lot of people who, like, they get their thing down and they, you know, that's how they make their little money, and so that they're a repeat machine. Well, that's, you know, I think whatever, because it's hard to break your mind or break your hand, but the poignancy of, I don't know if I can adapt quick enough. And it brings us back to the specificities of the distribution of bodies that have to adapt more or less quickly. Since this is a conversation about, you know, post-coloniality, racism, the change of the name, and et cetera. And some bodies, and the human and the more than human world, have, since that initial, you know, invasion of everything, had to always be, you know, it's like, keep changing, or stay the same so they don't, you know, just destroy you, which is a way of keep changing. While others got the false sense that they could just, you know, drift along having the same old body. So I think it's really important because the dream of endless adaptability is that deep kind of racialized capitalism. Oh, we just send climate change. Oh, we just continually adapt. We just have a technical solution. And I think that those who have lived this demand of like, you better figure it out. Can say like, I'm not sure if I can do it again, or I'm gonna try, but there's the kind of ethical humility about what it is to break your hand and break your mind again, which I'm all for. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But it's not. I mean, I definitely start from. Maybe we're going to end up in a really hopeless place. No. No. I mean, I have no. That's what I mean is if I say it, then I get us there. But yeah, I definitely am not in a, I'm not an adaptability. Like it's not in order to adapt to what's coming or in order to,
I know. You put it really well. It was like to be. It doesn't matter. To be. How did you put it?
For the recording, it'd be great.
To be. Okay.
I don't know what
you put it so well. To be open to where the boat was going, right? Is not adaptability. Adaptability is very much like, we just change and go forward. And how you were describing it, and I think you as well, is different. It's like, where is this water taking us, and how can I be with it, even if that means I'm not directing it. Yeah.
And also, I guess too, there's a moment in which, I'm not going to talk about like the specific moments where I've sort of reached these conclusions, but like, I guess you have to think and make work also with all the dead. We were talking about mediums, but not with the idea of who's coming after and who's going to be able to but in order to make some kind of justice, to think with the people that are already lost. So that's not about to make a new machine to think better for the future, but so that we can be ethically bound also to those that already are not here. I think that because there's a way in which the Vieques film, the black and white film, it's not necessarily all. It's not all there. It's not that it's full of meaning, but it was really thinking about the people, the generation of activists in Vieques that basically gave their life, literally, for getting the U.S. Navy out of there, and died this year, last year, the year before, or are dying from the sicknesses that they got, from cancer. Those people, how can I make sure that they are here, and that they're not. It's very. Again, I'm not really explaining very well, but maybe there's the new object or the new syntax is not necessarily a hope for the future.
Do we have time for me to take? I think it's a very important moment, this adaptability, and how you put it, that if we, because it brings a lot of questions of, I was just thinking, when I was 18, I had enough time and adaptability to cast myself as a Dutch painter, although I had never lived in the Netherlands. I decided I could, I was privileged enough, I could do it. I got here and I realized, oh God, I have to work so hard for changing some stuff and keeping some relations in place. Else I had to transform so much that I couldn't recognize myself anymore. So hence my interest in Persian literature, but also psychoanalysis. That was, again, a question of exhaust and waste and go talk so much of your free association so that you're gonna cast yourself afresh into a new person. But well, I think this particular project was very interesting because it was a test in how much institutionally we can adapt to new world, but also bring the former one to stay within the paradigm of historical thinking, because it was much easier to get rid of Witte de Weet altogether and not talk about him at all ever again, which was but somebody had to do the dirty job of exhuming that body out of the grave again and put him on the pedestal next to Melly and all the other things. But when it comes to living beings, that was where I realized, well, I mean, 4 days ago, the largest lake in Iran died after 15,000 years of people living with it. This was like a holy thing for pre-Zoroastrians already, and Zoroastrians, and other people. And you know, I cannot help but come to terms with the fact that my education, which I hold very dearly, the values, those enlightenment, those shared modernity, global modernism, global enlightenment, that I wanted to work so hard to bring the Islamicate, the North African, the rest of the world, the Caribbean, you know, fold it into back to this and reclaim it and say it's not only a West European thing to be modern, it's like a global thing, it's like a global project to be modern. Even if I manage to do that within discourse, this discourse is so not yet having tools to adapt itself to understand how nature is changing so quickly that the adaptability is not anymore of mine or of the people I try to represent here, one way or another, but that my painting tools, my artistic tools, my philosophical, psychoanalytical discourse tools do not know how to deal with the drought or extinction of certain beings. And I think, well, it deserves to be true and authentic, to be hopeless about it to some extent, without completely getting rid of the tools that at least we at this table learn to use as our tools of agency. You know, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure you have much more to add to this.
I was going to say improvisation and activism are the only two ways forward.
Absolutely. Improvisation as well, yes.
So, that was a really remarkable and improvised tag team of a conversation that we've had together. Thank you so much, Sam and Beatriz, for your incredible exhibitions and contributions to our program. Thank you, Beth and Francis, for joining us to open up responses, senses and interpretations or considerations of these exhibitions. We will be transitioning now into our opening celebrations for the season. Please indeed be welcome to bring your questions and conversations to everyone at the table. Again, I would strongly encourage you to also approach the curators from Sour Grass in their ongoing dialogues between Rotterdam and the Caribbean over these years. As well as the curator, Rosa de Graaf, who's been very involved with Beatriz's exhibition, and of course our dear director, Sofia Hernandez-Chonghui, who oversees and leads these programs, but also who has curated the exhibition of Pablo Castañeda, of which we will be having some specific programs coming up soon, and which is so closely related to these conversations in its focus on the American-Mexican border and the specific forms of governance, territoriality, and selfhood that shape place and people there. So, thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful evening with us today.
Thank you, Vivian, and thanks to Team Melly for making an example of adaptability. And,
yes, and thank you, of course, Lean and Jonathan and Jeroen for taking this evening.
All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you.